Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. Well, I have a new piece of gadgetry for the 1942 South Bend Lathe, and this is what's called a Trav-A-Dial. Now, these haven't been sold in quite some time, and the company that makes them makes no spare parts for them whatsoever, but this one right here seems like it's in decent shape. So on this lathe, there is no graduated dial on the carriage hand wheel, so there's no way to know how far I'm moving it as I turn the wheel. So if I need to move the carriage a specific distance for some operation, my only option really is to use a magnetic base dial indicator and then touch the end of it up against the carriage. And it works, but I can really only do this about 1 inch at a time maximum, and then I have to reset it, reset my zero, and then travel some more. So it'll work. It is a little bit cumbersome, but the Trav-A-Dial makes this a little bit, well, actually makes this entirely obsolete for 99% of the things that I would need to use the lathe for. And then of course, when I traverse in the opposite direction, it becomes more cumbersome because now I have to reset it to the short end of the travel before I can move it. And this just becomes a bit of a headache if you have to do this over and over. Now the Trav-A-Dial operates in direct contact with the lathe bed. Now it's attached to the carriage, and this wheel that's on the end of the Trav-A-Dial rides up against the lathe bed. And as the carriage moves left or right, this wheel is being turned because of that direct contact and then moves the dial. Now the main indicator has a resolution of 1/1000th of an inch, and it's 100,000ths for the total rotation. However, the auxiliary dial that's just above it can get you really up to about 6 inches. So anywhere between 0 and 6 inches in 1/1000ths of an inch increment. Now the bottom of the Trav-A-Dial has these two dovetails that slide into a special mount. Now I also have this very well used, probably many times over, special bracket that was manufactured by Trav-A-Dial for mounting these units to the carriage of a lathe. Now there's 4 screws that are used to essentially mount and level the Trav-A-Dial. These two on the bottom have a special spherical washer on them, and they're used to adjust the left and right tilt. And then these two on the bottom are used to adjust the forward and back tilt. Now the next thing I need to do is figure out just how I'm going to mount this bracket on the lathe. Well, I considered mounting it over here on the left side of the carriage, but quite frankly, I don't think there's really enough room for it. Plus, I don't think I'd really want it this close to the chuck. I think for some operations, this might be throwing hot chips down on that dial and likely going to end up melting the plastic cover on it. So I don't think that it's going to work over here for several reasons, so we'll have to use the right side of the carriage. Now the threading dial for my lathe is mounted over here on the right side, and I think I can take advantage of the already threaded hole in the side of the carriage in order to mount the bracket for the Trav-A-Dial. I think this side here is going to be a much more appropriate place to mount this. Well, let's see how this might or might not work here. I've got a bunch of holes to choose from here in the side of this thing. Let me try to get it mounted up here just to see if it's going to interfere with the lead screw or if there's any other adjustments I might need to make. Well, for starters, I'm going to need to make some kind of a spacer in here. I can't use the one that I have for the threading dial because it's spaced to be away from the carriage, where this one I'm going to want it to be tight up against not just the apron but also the saddle. So I'm going to take this off here and use a depth micrometer and see what the difference is between the saddle up here at the top and the apron, and see what I need to do to make a spacer. So off camera, I machined up this simple spacer, and let me get this bracket reinstalled and see what it looks like. So that fits pretty good, but it's not stable enough. I'm going to need to drill a hole in the bracket and then into the saddle and thread that for a second bolt. I also have no way of remounting my threading dial, so I'm going to have to drill and thread another hole in the opposite side of the bracket to relocate this. And because I need to install this at a certain height, it's going to interfere with me being able to use the wrench on the carriage lock. So I'm going to end up having to mill some of the top of this bracket off anyway. Well, I want to start by milling off the tops of the bracket just to make some clearance, at least for that carriage lock wrench. Well, I've touched off here with an end mill. We'll back up. I'll raise the table up, say 100 thousandths of an inch, and we'll start milling away, a couple 100 thousandths of the top of this bracket. Oh, well, I should have known better. This is kind of a rough casting. It's a cast aluminum bracket. So I need to do a little better job of clamping this thing into the vise, and then we'll start over. I have plenty of room to work with here, so this isn't a total failure. Well, a piece of welding wire between the front jaw of the vise and the bracket should take up any irregularities and give me a good clamp on this. As I'm milling away a bunch of this bracket, I am getting into some of the previously drilled holes into the bracket. I think I might end up milling away even more of these, at least on parts of this, than I need to for the clearance of the wrench, just to make it look a little bit nicer. Well, before I mill any more of the bracket away, I want to mount it up to the side of the apron so I can get an idea of where I need to drill the second mounting hole, and then we'll address these half holes once I figure that out. Well, I think I can figure out where this hole is going to need to be drilled visually, but to make it a little bit easier to see, when I scribe some lines, I'll use a little blue dicum. Just by eye, I'm sighting down from the top to where that machined pad is on the side of the saddle, and just scribing a line that's about in the center. And then I do the same thing here from the front. And just to double check here, I grabbed the saddle that's from the 1960 South Bend just to see what is behind this machine pad. Do I have enough meat back there to drill and thread a hole where it's not going to interfere with anything? And yeah, there's plenty of cast steel, cast iron behind that pad for me to drill and tap a hole. I went ahead and transferred my scribe lines to the outside of the bracket, which also told me I had plenty of clearance that I can mill away those half holes that were left behind, so I took care of that off camera. Well, I have a machinist jack here I'm going to put on the inside of the bracket, and this will keep this end of the bracket from deflecting as I drill through. I'm using my wiggler here to locate the center of those scribe lines. Followed up here by a 1/4-inch spotting drill. And now I'm going to drill the clearance hole for a 5/16 inch socket head cap screw. Well, I have the bracket now remounted on the lathe through the original mounting hole. I've got this little bubble level, the short little level, and I want to try to get this as level as I can so I can punch a center for the hole in the saddle. Well, I dug through my collection of rusty gauge pens and found one that was perfect for this clearance hole, and I ground a point on it. So now I can slide it into my clearance hole, and I can't fit the hammer in there, so I'm just using a brass drift here, and I'll give it a tap, and it should mark the center on the end of the saddle. And that is pretty much exactly where I was hoping this would end up. Well, I know I have plenty of room behind this pad, but I don't want to drill it too deep, so I put some tape on the drill. And I want to keep the drill bit nice and straight so it doesn't break off. So I want to use this drill guide. But I don't think the 5/16 hole is the right. This fits into the 1/4 inch slot, but then the tape interferes with it. So let me take the tape off and try this again. Well, I took the tape off here and I've got the drill guide lined back up, and this is where, well, it didn't go completely fail, but I did end up failing here a little bit. Something went a little bit wonky, and for whatever reason I ended up drilling off of my mark by a couple of millimeters, and it ended off center of the pad.
That move.
Well, fortunately, there's plenty of adjustment points that I can use when mounting the Trav-A-Dial, so this isn't quite the end of the world. It's just a little bit disappointing that I missed my mark. Well, the next thing to do is to go ahead and tap the hole. I'll start here with a taper tap to get it started, and then I'll finish it up with a bottoming tap. Well, I'm certain this bracket is going to be mounted and unmounted repeatedly, but I do need to get this mounted up here so I can see just how out of level or how level it is. Well, there's enough adjustability, enough looseness in the bracket mounts that I think I can get this back level without too much of a problem. Well, the next thing I need to do is take care of how I'm going to mount the thread dial now to the outside of the Trav-A-Dial bracket. Well, I need to locate this thing so not only is it at the right angle that I can see it, but also that the worm gear that's on the bottom of the thread dial engages with the lead screw properly. Well, just like before, I've got it clamped in the vise. I'll use a machinist jack to keep it from flexing. I'll locate the hole with my wiggler, and then we'll spot and drill the hole, the tap size hole, for a 3/8 inch socketed cap screw. I'll use a little anchor lube this time on the hole and on the tap. I'm going to power tap this thing at least to start, and then once I get the tap started, I'll finish it off by hand. Well, I have the bracket and the thread dial mounted back up on the carriage. There is something else I am going to need to take care of as well. There's not a whole lot of clearance here between the bracket and the Trav-A-Dial. So these socket head cap screws, I do want to machine them down a little bit just to provide a little bit more clearance. But I'll do that off camera. Well, the next thing to do is get the Trav-A-Dial ready to be mounted. Well, there's a foam pad that's supposed to be mounted to the front of the Trav-A-Dial, and it's kind of a way wiper to keep all of the chips and other stuff away from it and keep it nice and clear and keep debris out of this wheel. Now, there's someone on eBay that makes and sells the replacement foam. They're not cheap. It was, including shipping, $30 for 4 of these things. I don't think I'll go through more than one in my lifetime. I thought about making them, but I didn't know exactly what the material was supposed to be. But anyway, I'm going to clean this off a little bit here with some acetone before we try to stick this in place. I want to make sure I get this lined up correctly. I only have 4 chances to get it right. Okay, we should be ready to get this mounted. Well, the observant amongst you will probably notice that I painted the bracket as well as plugged a few of the Swiss cheese holes just to make this thing slightly more presentable. I thought about machining off the rest of those top protrusions, but I didn't really see much of a point in it. Now, the first thing I'm putting into the bracket here are the 2 pusher bolts. I think that's what Trav-A-Dial calls them. Now, these are used to adjust the forward and back tilt of the Trav-A-Dial. Well, with the Trav-A-Dial mounted to the mount, I can now mount the mount to the bracket. I'm using these puller screws, as they call them, and these are not just to hold the mount to the bracket, but to also adjust the left and right tilt of the Trav-A-Dial. Well, this mount is pretty interesting. You'll notice it has a little bit of flex to it, and that's going to become apparent here as we move forward. But the first thing I want to do is loosen up these set screws on the side of the dovetail so that I can push the Trav-A-Dial as far forward to the lathe bed as I can. With just a little bit of forward pressure here on the Trav-A-Dial, I want to snug those set screws. I don't want to make them tight. I just want to make them slightly snug. Well, even with those set screws snug, you'll see the Trav-A-Dial doesn't really move unless I put some force pressing it against the lathe bed. Well, and that's where this next piece comes into play. This allows me to adjust the tension of the Trav-A-Dial up against the lathe bed. Pardon the flashlight, but it's actually a little bit difficult to see up underneath here. So this bracket, this little tensioning bracket, attaches with a couple of hooks to the mount. And then there is a set screw that's in the back of it that pushes on the back of the Trav-A-Dial. And as I tighten the set screw, it actually increases the force in which the Trav-A-Dial is being pushed up against the side of the lathe bed. Well, there's not a lot of documentation on this particular mount, at least not that I could find. So how tight to make this is really not exactly known. I'm just hoping I don't make it too tight. So with some tension now on the Trav-A-Dial pushing that wheel up against the lathe bed, you can see as I move the carriage, the Trav-A-Dial is moving as well. Well, I was told I need to soak this foam pad down with some whey oil, so we'll do that now before I start moving this thing too much. Well, I'm not quite done yet here. I need to make sure that the Trav-A-Dial is level left and right, and then also that it's adjusted correctly forward and back. Well, there's 2 little buttons on the top of the Trav-A-Dial that's used for leveling it. So the first thing I need to do is set a dial indicator on one of the buttons and zero it. I'll move the carriage now down over to the other button, and it looks like I'm about 10 thousandths of an inch out of level. Well, this is where those puller screws come into play, the ones that pull it down. By loosening one and then tightening the other, I can adjust the left-right tilt of the Trav-A-Dial. Well, after a few different rounds of adjusting, going back and forth, it looks like I am well within half a thousandths of being level left to right. Well, the next thing I want to do is check for repeatability. So I have the Trav-A-Dial on 0, and then over here on the other side of the carriage, I have a mag-based dial indicator also on 0. Well, now what I want to do is just move the carriage some distance to the right. I'll move it a couple of inches. And then I'll move it back so that the Trav-A-Dial reads all zeros. With the Trav-A-Dial on 0, I'll come over here, look at the dial indicator, and it is exactly on 0. So at least for this one trip back and forth, it was perfectly repeatable. I need to do this a few more times and see if that stays consistent. Well, there's some other things I need to check to see if this thing is calibrated correctly, and that's going to involve some kind of a accurate gauge block. So, for example, if I have a 4-inch gauge block and I traverse the Trav-A-Dial 4 inches, am I actually traversing 4 inches? And that can be adjusted by using the forward and back pusher screws that are on the bottom of the Trav-A-Dial. What this does is it adjusts what part of the wheel is making contact with the lathe bed. I'll try to explain this the best I can. So it's first important to know that the wheel that the Trav-A-Dial is using is actually crowned on the edge. Well, this drawing is meant to represent the wheel as you were looking at it from the side, butted up against the lathe bed here, which is that gray box on the right. If we blow up my rudimentary illustration of the wheel, you can see that it only touches the lathe bed at one particular spot on the wheel. In essence, it means that the wheel on the Trav-A-Dial is really just the center section of a sphere. And if I put a couple of lines on our sphere, this vertical one is representing the pivot point about which the sphere or the wheel rotates. And the horizontal one is representing the radius of the sphere at the center of the sphere around that rotational point. And if I were to take a look at different sections of the sphere using the same center point, you can see the length of that line gets smaller and smaller. If I go back to my original illustration, you can see that that line there is representing the true radius of the sphere. If I were to rotate the pivot point, you can see here, if we zoom in, that the part of the sphere that's touching the lathe bed is no longer in the center and is no longer as long as it was before. It's now shorter. So what exactly does this mean as it relates to the Trav-A-Dial specifically? Well, what it means is if the Trav-A-Dial is tilted either forward or back differently, then the radius of the circle around which the wheel is rotating is going to be different because a different part of the crown is touching the side of the lathe bed. Well, and since the radius will now affect the circumference of the wheel, the distance that the carriage moves will alter the amount that the wheel rotates in the Trav-A-Dial, which then alters what's being displayed on the indicators. So the question remains is how much can this really affect the precision of the Trav-A-Dial? Let's take some example numbers. These aren't exact, but they're approximate. Let's say the wheel that's running along the lathe bed is 1/2 of an inch in radius, which means the circumference of it is 3.1416 inches, meaning every time the wheel moves one circumference, it's moving 3.1416 inches. But if the Trav-A-Dial is tilted at such a point in which the radius of the sphere section that's touching the lathe bed is only 1/1000th of an inch shorter, look what it does to the distance traveled. But the Trav-A-Dial is still going to read 3.1416 inches. It's a difference of almost 6.5 thousandths of an inch over roughly 3 inches. Now, maybe you don't need that kind of precision. Maybe I don't need that kind of precision. I'm going to have to do some experimenting and testing with it once I figure out how I'm going to measure that in order to determine whether or not I am going to want to adjust it. But looking at the documentation that I do have for Trav-A-Dial, the gauge block setup that they're expecting me to use is something that I don't have. I really don't have any good description or diagram of it. If you have a Trav-A-Dial and know how I can make a 4-inch or 6-inch gauge for this, I'd certainly appreciate it. I'd like to get it as close as I can. It doesn't look like it'd be too difficult to do it if I had the right tools. But that's going to have to wait for a different day. I'm not even sure if I'll record that on video. I've just run out of time in the shop for this week. Well, don't forget, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Leave me a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. And subscribe if you're not a subscriber. It costs you nothing to subscribe. And all of those things put together really help me in my channel with the YouTube algorithm. And always a special thanks to those that help support the channel on Patreon and PayPal. And there's links down in the description if that's something that you'd like to do. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.